So this is a little different from how I normally do things on this channel. Part of the reason actually why I decided to get a video out now is because I had promised myself that I would get a new episode of the music history series out before the end of the year, which obviously hasn't happened. So I thought I'd give you a little update and sort of explain where I am at with things and why it's taking me a bit longer to get the new episode, or rather episodes, out. And I also thought, since I'm doing a video, that it might be interesting to kind of look at a few examples of some of the kinds of instruments that we've been talking about so far, and to maybe drill in a little bit more specifically into the idea of what is and isn't a musical instrument, or how we kind of discern these things and how we understand those terms, and also some of the complexity that comes with trying to apply some of those ideas and categories that are very much informed by our own cultural experience onto other cultures, or projecting them onto the past. Generally, I would say for most Westerners, when we think of musical instruments, we would generally think of things like violins and pianos, guitars, those kinds of instruments. But as we've gone into a few times now, I think, in the music history series, these are very recent examples of musical instruments in the broader scope of human musicking. If we were to take, let's say maybe the last 200,000 years since the advent of anatomically modern humans, when we can imagine that definitely there would have been a number of forms of proto-musicking, ultimately then coalescing into the kind of musicking that we see around the world now, at least 50,000 years ago, but probably way before that, 100,000 years ago perhaps. And so when we look at this broader scope of the human musicking experience, of the human animal as a musicking animal, right? Because musicking, being a musical animal, is one of the defining characteristics of the human species. We see it across all cultures all around the world. So in the scope of this broader human musical experience, again, say about a couple of 100,000 years or so, then instruments like the piano and the guitar, that have only been around for a couple of 100 years really, with a few precursors and then also some evolution since then, but around about a couple of centuries, and then violins going back a little bit prior to that, but again still within only the last few centuries. These are not necessarily the most representative of the broader human musicking experience. And in fact, when we look back into the past, it can become a lot harder to discern what is and isn't a musical instrument according to our very rigid and simple categorization. But this isn't necessarily the case just for the past. This is also true when we look at modern tools. For example, if you take one of these bendy boys, is this a musical instrument? Most people would probably say no off the top of their heads, but we've all had the experience of playing one of these, right? Anyone who has been in school bored out of their minds, and let's face it, who hasn't at some point, right? I would imagine almost any school kid has had that experience of placing these on the edge of their desk and giving it a good old twang and finding that it produces a really interesting, curious and funny sound, and of then kind of playing around with that and listening to all the different sounds that they can create, the very low ones by placing it all the way on the edge of the desk, bringing it in and finding there's much higher pitched sounds, realizing that you can slide it and create sliding tones while you're playing it, and also obviously all kinds of rhythmical patterns. And school kids all around the world are doing this kind of thing, not because someone is telling them to, but because in a sense, it comes very, very naturally to us as human beings to play around with things in this curious sort of way of wanting to sort of tinker and poke at things and just kind of see what happens. And in fact, we don't normally think of musical instruments in this way. You know, most people wouldn't say that something like a ruler is a musical instrument. And yet that kind of experience that a child has when they first find that a ruler makes all these interesting sounds, and have also been drawn to doing it, right? Once you find that it makes that sound, then you want to do it over and over again. This sort of innate desire and also joy in just sort of tinkering with things, and then especially when you get a response and such a curious and interesting acoustical response to your behavior, then you're almost drawn to keep doing it, right? And to try different variations, and there's a certain kind of natural delight that we get in receiving that kind of response from a stimulus that we give to the world. And that experience in many ways is probably a lot more representative of the human musicking experience and the human musicking instinct in a much broader sense than some of those instruments that we think of more commonly, which are only the end result, very, very recent technological innovations that are very contingent on a certain cultural, technological, and even a certain kind of societal ideas about what music is and what's desirable in music and how it should be performed. The kinds of instruments that we normally think of are very, very specific and in many ways culturally contingent. This kind of experience here, that all kids have with a ruler, taps into something much more universal about the musical experience and the musicking instinct, in the sense that it's probably likely that quite a few musical instruments had origins somewhat of that kind. For example, you'll probably remember how in episode 6 we discussed how we believe that probably the majority, if not maybe even all, string instruments ultimately descend from the bow, as in the kind of bow that you're thinking of with bows and arrows, right? And obviously we don't really know necessarily what the genealogy is there, what the bow would have initially been developed for and used for, whether it was initially used for hunting or in all kinds of other ways, because bows can be used in many, many different ways, as drills, as ways, as means for starting fires, and also as musical instruments, and we still see that in the world today. And in fact, we even see instances where bows that maybe are used for hunting at other points in their lives can be used as musical bows, and that they can be converted from being one to the other. And so even today, we see that one use does not exclude the other. So in terms of saying what the bow was initially developed for, and then how that ultimately led to the development of string instruments, it's essentially impossible to really unpick how that might have happened, not only because of the lack of remains, but because even if we did have a huge number of remains, it would still be very difficult just from finding bows to then discern what they were used for. But it is quite easy to imagine that once a technology such as the technology of the bow did exist, then humans who had those, sooner or later, somebody would have just been sat there and playing with it, again, for no reason at all, in the same way that a child doesn't have a specific reason when they first try twanging the ruler over the desk. There's not necessarily so much of an end goal in mind. It's just this natural desire, instinct that we have for being essentially very curious about the world around us. And if you were to do that with a bow, if you just sort of twang at the string, very quickly you realize that it does make quite an interesting, strange sound. And you would also then realize that by tensing or releasing the string, by adding tension or by removing tension, then you can create all kinds of different pitches, and again, sliding pitches, rhythmical patterns, and so on. And this is very much how we see musical bows even being played today, with tension being introduced into the string and released in order to achieve different pitches, even sliding pitches, and the instruments are often played in a rhythmical, droning manner. And in fact, this idea that our innate tendency to just poke at things and just kind of see what happens when you play around with things, often in a completely idle manner, not in one where you're intentionally even thinking, well, I want to see what happens when I do this, but just that mindless playing around that then sort of surprises us when you get an interesting result, like an unusual sound or something like that. I think that that's often not discussed enough when we talk about how things may have developed over the course of human history in terms of technologies and different ideas. Now, obviously, one of the reasons why it's not very much talked about is the fact that it's something that's very difficult to quantify or to kind of really talk about in any kind of analytical manner. But the reality is that we know that that's very much how human beings are. That's what we're all like. We've all done things like that, and we all do things like that all the time. Often when we look at inventions, there's a tendency to want to find a something of a rational explanation. For example, with wind instruments, one could imagine that maybe humans would have initially discovered the sounds that you can make while blowing through a pipe. Maybe, for example, when trying to revive a fire, right, and blowing through a reed in that kind of way. But again, we don't necessarily need that kind of an explanation, because it could also very much be the case that it was just something that was stumbled upon, maybe even many times, in a completely idle manner by human beings, just kind of doing nothing, as it were. But all kinds of things happen when people do nothing. At any rate, what we can deduce or make a reasonable guess at in terms of musicking and musical behaviors in the past and during the prehistoric world is that undoubtedly, just as the way that there's many ways, for example, in which the bow is used, and it can have musicking applications, but it also can be used for hunting and for all kinds of other activities. In a similar way, musicking would have bled into a lot of other activities in this kind of way, and there would have been much more crossover in the way in which some tools or some items might have been used, and things that we may or may not think of necessarily as musical instruments would still have been part of musicking activities that would have been much more interwoven in the day-to-day activities of the community. One of the defining features about the way in which we within Western culture think about music is that ultimately, over the course of the last few centuries, and especially once we came into the modern world, music has gradually become more segregated, separated away from the other day-to-day activities of our lives. Whereas when we look at other cultures around the world, especially foraging peoples, hunter-gatherers, and other cultures that live traditional life ways that are more similar to maybe some of the kinds of life ways that people would have lived even in the West in pre-industrial times, what we see is that musicking behaviors of various kinds are deeply interwoven into the patterns of activities of the day-to-day life of the community. It is not simply that music is present in the way in which it is, for example, in our culture, and you could say that in our culture music is more present than it has ever been because of the prevalence of recorded music, background music that is almost everywhere, and music that we listen to while we're working and all kinds of other things like that. But the difference is that within our context, for most people, music simply tends to be a backdrop. It functions as some sort of background for our day-to-day life, but it's not interwoven with the activities themselves. What we find in many traditional cultures is that many of the activities of day-to-day life are already interwoven with all kinds of patterns that run through and ripple through these activities on a day-to-day basis. And many of these activities contain patterned and rhythmical gestures and repetitious gestures. And so these often then become interwoven with all kinds of musicking behaviors. You'll have heard maybe some recordings you might have noticed in the music history series For example, actions like sifting grain and millet and other kinds of seeds and grasses, grinding food and grinding grain, working a hide, for example, with a knife, the repetitious gesture. These become all interwoven with musicking activities and musicking behaviors that not only enhance and develop and create a patterning throughout the activity, which also provides a sort of template around which this activity can be organized, but they often contain information or stories or other aspects that also pertain to the activity themselves, and so that encapsulate a lot of the information about the activities themselves, and naturally, obviously, the gestures themselves becoming formalized through patterned musicking behaviors. The gestures themselves also contain information on how to perform this activity, and so the formalization and the musicalization of these activities often encapsulates then within the gesture itself the pattern for that activity. So it also provides a means by which to capture information in a non-verbal way, as well as then also on top of that, within the context of singing and musicking behaviors that contain song and words and so on, providing mnemonics in the way in which information, verbal information, can be encapsulated in a much more transmissible manner within a patterned context. We all know the fact that a song is in essence fairly easy to memorize, whereas a block of text of that same length is a lot harder to memorize. So a combination of the mnemonic qualities of musicking behaviors, along with the way in which they can formalize and encapsulate information about gestural activities, combined with the our natural tendency to find patterned, repetitious gestural structures within the activities that we do. You can think of anything from working a stone tool. That beating activity can acquire a rhythm, along with all the other kinds of activities that we described just now, the sifting, grinding, scraping a hide, anything like that. And so within these contexts, we see all kinds of things that, a little bit like the ruler, other kinds of things that we might not think of as musical instruments. For example, we might not think of a knife as being a musical instrument, but if it's being used to scrape a hide, and that activity becomes a patterned, rhythmic, musical activity infused also with song, and the repetitious gesture naturally contains within it an element, something of what we would consider to be dance, then you can see that it starts to become a little bit more complex, because that knife or that grindstone, those are all things that are ultimately being used, yes, for that activity itself, but also for the sonic patterned acoustical structures that they create, the kind of thing that we would normally call music. And there is an intentional desire to enhance the musical qualities of the sound structures that result from that activity. And the functional, what we would at least consider to be the functional aspects of that activity and the musicking aspects of that activity cannot be separated, in particular because the idea that we would have of there being a functional aspect and a musicking aspect being separate, again, is because of the way in which we have segregated musicking behaviors away from the other things. Whereas, as we just said, that those musicking behaviors could contain all kinds of information, both verbal and gestural, as well as providing a formalized template for that activity, meaning that they are very, very useful and functional as well as being aesthetic, these musicking behaviors. So they are very much interwoven into the actual function of the activity, as well as enhancing it and creating something maybe of incredible aesthetic beauty. And in fact, examples of this kind can maybe help to further go into what I meant when I said that the way that Westerners will often look at the artifacts and the behaviors of other cultures, and especially foraging peoples, hunter-gatherers. We will have a tendency to want to go in and say, well, is this art, or is it ritual or religion or magic, or kind of separating these things out as if implying that there is a separation there. But again, this is very much an artifact of the way in which we think about these things. And so we shouldn't expect to be able to find these kinds of distinctions when we're looking at other cultures, and also as we project back into the past and look in the archaeological record. So what is a musical instrument? Well, this is ultimately, at the end of the day, a fairly arbitrary category that we impose upon things, and that in fact there is a lot of ambiguity and there's a lot of blurring, and there is no clear distinction really between what is and isn't a musical instrument. But in terms of musicology, often the way in which we describe a musical instrument, or the definition, as it were, for a musical instrument, is that a musical instrument is really defined by intentionality. Is the intention to use this object for musicking, basically? And then, if so, it is a musical instrument. In other words, a musical instrument could be almost anything. And in fact, even within Western music, we can probably all think of examples where objects that normally we would not consider to be musical instruments are being used very intentionally for specifically musical outcomes. However, when we talk about intentionality, there are a couple of different levels on which we can talk about intentionality. The first one is the intention of the person. So is the person using this object in a way where their intent ultimately is the creation of some sort of musicking gestural pattern, in the same way that, for example, somebody taking a ruler and twanging it over the desk, in that moment, the ruler is a musical instrument in that sense, in that person's intentionality is not to use it, say, in the way in which we would more conventionally use it to draw a straight line, but to create these interesting patterned sounds. On the other hand, there's the question of the intentionality of what intention was in the design of this object. So, for example, in this case, the ruler would not really fall into that category, because the intention when designing the ruler isn't that of creating a musical instrument. It isn't designed from a sound design perspective in terms of what sounds it will produce. It's designed to draw straight lines, basically. That's what its more accepted function is. On the other hand, obviously, we have a huge number of tools and instruments that are built expressly with the intention and with the desire that they should be used for musicking. And that would be the kind of category that most of the things that we normally think of as musical instruments, such as violins and pianos and guitars and so on, would fall into, because those are tools that have been intentionally designed and refined, in fact, over time, specifically to enhance their ability to produce all kinds of patterned sound structures, the kinds of gestures and activities that we would consider to be music. So with all of this complexity and ambiguity in place, what does this really look like when we start to look back in the archaeological record? What would the earliest instruments have been? Well, obviously, as we mentioned when we were looking at prehistoric musical instruments in episode 6 of our series, what we would probably, if we were to go back in time and observe prehistoric humans, probably a few hundreds of thousands of years ago, the earliest behaviors that, when we look at them, we would recognize as being some kind of proto-musicking, even if maybe they might not be thinking of it in that way, but the kinds of things that we would recognize as being musicking, or the kinds of things that will lead ultimately to musicking, would be some form of singing, probably some kind of song-like vocalization, and also beating gestures. Very basic forms of percussion, even the simple stomping of feet or beating of the hands on the body, those kinds of things, and obviously the beating of objects. And those are the kinds of earliest things that we would probably associate with musicking behaviors if we could travel back in time. However, these are things that don't really leave any trace in the archaeological record. I mean, singing doesn't leave any kind of trace in that sense, other than potentially aspects of the paleoneurology, in other words, the evolution of certain cognitive abilities, along with obviously also the evolution of the larynx and the way in which we can sort of look at when maybe humans would have had or developed the capacity to do the kinds of things that we associate with singing. But there is no evidence of how and when they started doing these kinds of things. And similarly with the beating gestures, even when we find evidence of repetitious beating on a given surface, how do you know that that beating was done for musicking purposes? Obviously, there are some, especially more recent instances in the last few thousand years, where we can see evidence of intentional repeated beating, sometimes even over the course of centuries or millennia, on specific spots of certain rocks, for example, the examples of the rock gongs that we gave, and those specific spots produce very resonant, distinct metallic tones. And so the idea that these rocks were being constantly hit in these specific spots that produce these tones, and that nobody was noticing ancient humans, especially humans who were in much closer contact with the natural world than we are, and humans who had much more refined and quicker senses and who were much more alert to the world that was immediately around them, that they somehow wouldn't have noticed these properties and been delighted in them in exactly the same way that we are, despite having all the same capacities and the same neurology that we do. That seems very unlikely. So there are many instances in which we can say, well, quite likely these were instances of musicking behaviors, but again, a lot of these tend to be a bit more recent, and in the majority of cases when you see evidence of repeated beating on structures, it's essentially almost impossible to say what that specifically is evidence of. And so that's the reason why within the archaeological record, the earliest kinds of things that we can look at and clearly say, well, that is clear evidence of musicking, would be objects somewhat like this one. In fact, not exactly like this. This kind of design, this we have evidence of going back maybe around about sort of 5,000 years or so into the past, around the Mediterranean. But flutes of some sort essentially are the earliest objects that we can look at and sort of clearly say, well, this is an object that was built intentionally to be used for musicking. And the earliest examples that we have go back to about 43,000 years ago. And the reason why we're able to do this with flutes is because, unlike other cases, they're a lot less ambiguous. There's not really many other reasons why you would create an object that is essentially a long reed of some sort or a long bone of some sort that's hollow, that's either been intentionally hollowed out, or a bone that's already hollow, into which finger holes have been intentionally bored at certain intervals. And even more specifically, we know even in these earliest instances that these are specifically finger holes because of the detail and the sophistication in the way in which these were created. These holes are all scalloped, just as you see in a modern recorder today, creating that sort of depression around the hole, which means that then the finger finds it a lot easier to find the hole, and also allows for all kinds of expressive inflections of the tone by moving the finger. And so these were very clearly, very intentionally, these objects were being built with the express intention of being used for to produce the kinds of things that we would call music. But obviously, something like a flute of any kind really is actually a pretty sophisticated and pretty complex tool. In addition, the specific examples that we have from about 43,000 years ago are incredibly sophisticated and advanced even in the specifics of the ways in which they're made, meaning that these can't be the first examples of flutes that humans ever made. And there are, in fact, those who think that probably there's flutes dating back to 60,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, that either we just haven't found yet, or that for some reason haven't been preserved. After all, even today, especially again amongst most foraging peoples, hunter-gatherers, any kinds of peoples who live in traditional lifeways, wooden flutes tend to be the most common, and we have to imagine that this would have been the case also in the past, whereas the ones that survive to the modern day are made out of bone, because bone is a lot less perishable than wood. But the likelihood is that many, many fewer flutes were being made out of bone or mammoth tusk, even, as one very, very famous and very striking example. An example that would have required weeks and weeks of work, and is a pretty insane piece to look at. It's sort of one of those equivalents of like a Michelangelo's David for the prehistoric world. And I think it's interesting because we often think of some of the sculptures in that way, when we see some of the Venuses and that, and we talk about them being great works of art. But we often don't necessarily think of the prehistoric flutes in those ways, but we have to imagine that an object that was made out of mammoth tusk, and that therefore could have been smoothed out to be incredibly iridescent, and with the amount of work that would have gone into shaping the inside of that, and then boring the finger holes, the fact that it had to be cut in half so that it could be scraped out and then glued back together, and the amount of work that would have gone into this would have made this object incredibly prized and incredibly beautiful, even just from a visual perspective. And then on top of that would have produced these very, very surprising and this very richly varied number of sounds that essentially nothing else could produce at the time, right? So it would have been an incredibly stunning artifact, something probably of very, very great power at the time. And so, yes, we find these examples of things that we can definitely say, well, these have to be musical instruments. There's no real other explanation that seems anywhere near as plausible. But if we find artifacts that are this complex and this advanced 43,000 years ago, then clearly humans were doing this kind of thing going much, much further back. And even before flutes themselves, as I said, the flute is a very complex piece of technology, because you have to think that something much, much simpler than a flute is just, for example, the single pipe. And just one pipe on its own will produce a single pitch. And, well, there's a few ways of producing different pitches out of a single pipe: overblowing, bending, a few other techniques like that. But on the whole, you're relatively limited in the number of pitches that you can produce with a single pipe. If you want different pitches, then you need pipes of different lengths, so you need to have a whole bunch of different pipes. Or, and this would have been quite a significant innovation when it happened, and again, who knows exactly when it happened, you can take all of those different sized pipes and collapse them into a single object by introducing finger holes, which means that you can simulate different pipes of different lengths simply by opening and closing the different finger holes, and therefore varying the path that the air takes through the pipe itself. And therefore, in a sense, this is a very complex, since almost abstract object that contains within it many, many different pipes, and it is simply simulating all those different pipes through the manipulation of the opening and closing of the finger holes. So again, if humans were doing all this kind of stuff at least 43,000 years ago, probably earlier than that, maybe 60,000, 70,000 years ago, maybe even earlier, who knows, right? Then earlier, simpler forms of musicking, and then before that, even proto-musicking, would have a rich history going much, 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 much further back. And we can imagine that at least very rich proto-musical behaviors would have probably been around from the times of anatomically modern humans, starting around about 200,000 years ago. And precursors to that, simpler forms of proto-music, might stretch back even further than that. Now, some of the earliest forms of musical instrument would most likely have been some form of percussion instruments. And as we said earlier, we don't really have any way of knowing how far back in time that stretches. One of the reasons for that is obviously, as we said, when we find examples of beating gestures, who knows what that is evidence for. But also other forms of percussion instruments, such as rattles, for example, which, to be honest, are some of the instruments that fascinate me the most, as strange as that might seem. Recently, I've really been getting interested in rattles, lots of these different kinds of objects and the whole variety of ways in which they are built and the numbers of materials out of which they're built. You'll probably remember from episode 6 me saying that we even find evidence of rattles built out of spiders' nests. So there's all kinds of really interesting, unusual ways in which rattles are built, but also the ways in which they're used and the functions and the significances that they have within different contexts. But so, for example, say with an object like this, which is made out of the rattle portion of it, the actual chimes, the beaters of the rattle, are made out of tree bark. So say if you had an object like this and it was left outside for a few tens of thousands of years, what would survive of this, honestly? You've got rope and you've got tree bark, both of which are almost certainly going to rot away and literally nothing is going to be left. But let's say some of the bark does actually survive. Well, what are you going to end up with? Well, a few hundreds of tiny fragments of tree bark. What's that going to tell you? Or you might be lucky enough to end up with preserving some of these sections here that have the holes through which they're strung. Again, though, what does that tell you? Does that tell you that this was a musical instrument? Could it not be a pendant or something else? And that's, for example, the problem that we have with the earliest examples of what we interpret to maybe be bull roarers. The bull roarer is, at the end of the day, a sort of surfboard-shaped flat piece of, like I said, almost any kind of material, actually. Bone, wood, you could use anything really to make a bull roarer attached to a piece of string. And then by rotating it, it produces all these incredibly powerful sounds. Especially if you listen to it within an enclosed environment or a kind of space that would have been similar to maybe some of the caves in which some of these ancient bull roarers would have been played. It's an incredibly powerful kind of sound, and you can immediately understand why, even among many of the cultures that still use the bull roarer today, it has this reputation of being a talking instrument, or one through which all kinds of forces and beings speak. But with these earliest examples of finds that can be interpreted to be bull roarers, as we discussed in the series, it's very hard to look at it and say for certain this is a bull roarer. It could be a pendant, it could be a fishing weight. There's all kinds of things that a flat object of that kind with a hole going through it could have. There are some examples that we very specifically consider to be potentially very good candidates, such as the La Roche paleophone, because of having the ochre pigment over it, which tells us that it would have been coloured in red ochre. Red ochre isn't water resistant, so the likelihood that it was used in fishing activities would seem to be quite low. And also it's quite large, so it could be a pendant or some other kind of ceremonial item. But again, it seems to be pretty much the exact kind of thing that you would expect to find if you did find an ancient bull roarer. And obviously there's further investigative work that could be done on some of these finds, especially around the wear that forms around the hole as it is spun, that could give us some sort of indication as to whether this object is a bull roarer or not. And if we could confirm these would be incredibly, incredibly important finds, because they would be the earliest examples that we have of what is one of the most common or widely dispersed musical instruments in the world, and essentially in pre-industrial societies and the musicking of pre-industrial cultures. We find it across all continents, and it has incredibly deep and significant connotations. The talking aspect of it and the way in which it's used to channel all kinds of powers, but also in many instances the great secrecy or reverence that is held around bull roarers. So its widespread existence throughout the world, even prior to the kinds of intercontinental travel and communications that we have now, and the deep significance that it has in many cultures. Both of these point to very, very ancient origins, and most paleomusicologists would be quite happy to say that they do think that an instrument like the bull roarer goes back several tens of thousands of years at least, most likely. But to have concrete evidence of that would be very, very significant. Now, the case of rattles, and in fact I have a few different ones here. Here the chimes are made out of nutshells, and the instance of rattles does also bring into question a whole other aspect, in fact the one that we started from, which is that aspect of intentionality, defining a musical instrument or a musicking tool of some kind. And the reason for that is that rattles are played in a variety of different ways. They can be played in ways that we would kind of think of as very typically musical, shaken, hit against the hand. But rattles can also be worn, such as this one. And they can be worn in a variety of ways, right? And so this does open up quite a can of worms, really, because you can have, say, for example, an object like this one, which this object is, and these are all nutshells going around the edge of this one here. Now, this object is very clearly and intentionally built to be worn in the same way that you would wear an item of clothing or jewelry like a bracelet. So not simply to be held and played in the kinds of ways that we'd normally think of playing a musical instrument, which normally involves some kind of manipulation. This is meant to be worn. And then the musicking patterns are obviously created by the movement of the hand, gestural patterns. And these can be both intentional and, in a certain sense, non-intentional or subconsciously intentional. And what we mean by that is that you could create, rhythmical patterns with specific movements of the hands that are intended to create a specific acoustic response. But you could also be wearing these and simply be dancing. But if you're dancing, then your gestures would tend to have some sort of repetitious patterned element to them, especially a lot of the kind of dancing in which we see these sorts of rattles being worn. And so simply through the act of dancing, the resulting acoustic patterns that this bracelet / rattle would produce would be patterned structures of sound, exactly the kind of thing that we would normally consider to be music of some sort. And so you can see that this is now starting to blur the lines a little bit again. Now, most people, I feel, would probably still consider something like this to be a musical instrument of some sort. And I would imagine that part of the reason for that is because it's associated with the hand. It's worn on the wrist, so it's very closely associated with the hand, and it's associated with gestures of the hand. And we very much associate the hand with intentionality, intentional manipulation, and in fact, most of the things that we normally consider to be musical instruments are played using the hands in some way or other, right? They're manipulated to some extent using the hands. And so I feel that the association between this rattle and the hand being worn in this way makes it in some ways more similar to our ideas about what a musical instrument is, compared to maybe some other objects that in essence are almost identical to this, but where maybe some people would then start to sort of move away from considering them to be musical instruments. And that would be, say, for example, imagine an object exactly identical to this, except that it's not been built to be worn on the wrist, but is meant to be worn as a necklace. Now, how many people would consider that to be a musical instrument? And yet again, if you're wearing it while dancing or jumping in any kind of rhythmical way, or even like beating the body in a rhythmical way while wearing something like that, then the result would create the kinds of sound structures that we, again, if we just heard them, would consider to be some sort of music, some sort of musicking. In fact, as I mentioned, I think in episode 3, actually, I'm going to take this off, otherwise it will just keep making sound the whole time. But when we look back into history, and for many of the people who kind of take the paleomusicological approach to thinking about music and are thinking of this much broader history of music, then the kind of separation that we normally see in the West between music and dance, which are almost considered to be separate disciplines at this point, and in fact that some of the practitioners of the two, there are some who are very who very almost proudly, we could say, proclaim that the two are very distinct and very separate. But in fact, we see in countless instances across the world, not only the kind of overlap where these two activities are happening at the same time, but activities in which it's very hard to say whether someone is dancing or performing music. And yeah, I can't remember exactly which episode it was. It was one of the earlier ones, probably episode 3. But I mentioned there, for example, if you had somebody who is energetically, rhythmically stomping, moving their body, slapping their body in a patterned way, then the question is this person dancing or are they performing music? And similarly, again, if you were then to augment this with all kinds of beadwork and rattles that are meant to be worn, you can see a lot of blurring of the lines going on, or more specifically, you get blurring of the lines happening if you're approaching it through the lens of the kinds of arbitrary categories into which we normally divide things. So you start to see that you find objects where you can't simply say, oh, this is an item of clothing, some sort of ceremonial item of clothing, or a musical instrument. Well, maybe it's both in some ways, and doesn't simply sit within one category or the other. And similarly, we see all kinds of activities where it's very difficult to say, well, this is specifically music in the sense that excludes dance, in the same way that we kind of segregated music away from many other activities. There's also been this split that has occurred to some extent between music and dance as well within Western culture, and there's all kinds of very interesting historical reasons around this, which are some of the things that we will be looking into, especially once we go into the ancient world and start looking at the ways in which many of the ideas in Greek philosophy ultimately very, very deeply influenced and affected the ways in which we think of music still today. Much of the way in which we still think of music now, in fact, is very influenced by classical Western musicology and ideas within what is sometimes called Western high art music, whatever that means. Again, another fairly arbitrary category that we impose on musicking behaviors. But the way in which many of those were then in turn previously influenced by ideas stretching all the way back to Greek philosophy and then later medieval theology, and the way in which that incorporated many aspects of Platonism, or what is sometimes called Neoplatonism, and the ways in which those influence the medieval understanding of what music is from Boethius onwards, and then into the later Middle Ages, and how that ultimately then gave rise to the conception that we have of music within the modern Western world. And all of those steps are very, very culturally contingent and led to a very specifically, again, culturally contingent way of thinking about music that is very particular to Western culture. And when you look at this much, much broader scope of human musicking that also incorporates nomadic peoples and foragers and so on, and the much bigger scope of human history going back a couple of 100,000 years ago, then you start to see that the way in which we think of music today is actually quite an anomalous way of thinking about music. But again, it's very deeply influenced by some of these ideas, and we will be looking at how this happened and the ways in which these ideas and cultural practices ultimately influence the way in which we think of music now. Now, if we look at instances of objects where it becomes very difficult to say whether, for example, something is an item of clothing or item of ceremonial clothing, and on the other hand, some sort of musical instrument, or at the very least something where this object has been produced not only for its aesthetic visual qualities, but where there is also a lot of attention to the sonic properties of this object. One of the most striking examples is the ceremonial costumes of the Mamutones in Sardinia, in Italy, which is a very striking tradition. And there you can see that obviously there is an intense interest in creating a very striking visual presence, but similarly also an incredibly striking sonic presence with all the bells that are placed on the back to create a certain sound, right? It's to create a certain visual aspect, which is very, very intense and very awe-inspiring and also slightly terrifying. And in the same way, to do the same with sound, this incredibly powerful clangor of the bells. In the ceremonial costumes of the Mamutones, we see both a visual design and a sound design happening at the same time. But their choice of the bells being the objects that are essentially being used as rattles here opens up yet another way in which we can see that there is ambiguity around the ways in which we think of what is and isn't a musical instrument. Because, for example, a bell is something that a lot of people would consider to be a musical instrument, and yet it's the kind of thing that is often also used for uses that are not specifically musical, often for signaling in the ways in which they were traditionally used in boats and rail tracks, those kinds of things, and also the ways in which they're hung from the necks of animals so that you can keep track of their positions, right? Cowbells, that sort of thing. And so we see here an inverse of, for example, the case of the ruler that we saw earlier, right? Bells are the kinds of things that instead we would call a musical instrument. But then again, we know that there are many, many bells that are built not with the intention of being used specifically musically, simply though to be used for their sonic properties in some other ways, so for signaling and those kinds of things there. So on the one hand, you have objects that a lot of people would not consider to be musical instruments, but which in fact are used like that very often, in fact, like the ruler. And then on the other hand, you have objects that a lot of people would consider to be musical instruments, such as the bell, but which very often are also being used not specifically for musical activities, but for other kinds of reasons, such as signaling. And in fact, even in the archaeological record, we see examples of objects that are clearly being used for their sonic properties, but which we think may have been used for things that aren't necessarily the kinds of things that we would consider to be music. One example of this is the phalangeal whistles, which are made out of the phalanx of hoofed animals. Reindeer tend to be some of the more common ones. And it is believed that these were probably used for signaling, maybe during a hunt, and also possibly to manipulate the behaviors of reindeer, because of a series of experiments that have been done which showed that the sounds of the phalangeal whistles could actually have quite an influence on the behaviors of the reindeers, and that influence those behaviors in ways which would be very useful to the hunters. And again, the fact that we fairly easily stumbled upon the fact that these phalangeal whistles are able to produce these kinds of effects on animals. If we were able to stumble upon this quite easily, then again, our ancestors who lived in such close contact with the natural world and had such an intimate and deep knowledge of the natural world around them, the kind of knowledge that we can't even really begin to imagine, then the idea that they would not have stumbled upon these acoustic properties of the phalangeal whistle and the way in which it really does seem to almost sort of mesmerize, hypnotize reindeer. And we talked a little bit more in detail about this in episode 6 of the music history. These are objects that would have held very, very deep significance and power, almost certainly. And again, they may have been used for their acoustic properties, but they might not have necessarily been used for the kinds of activities that we would consider to be musical. Then again, the fact that maybe they were used for signaling and maybe to manipulate the behaviors of reindeer does not exclude the fact that they might also have been used for musical activities. And again, you can see how really complex it becomes to try to discern one from the other in these kinds of instances. And so again, we have evidence of these artifacts, again stretching back in the last couple of tens of thousands of years, where we can see objects that very clearly seem to be objects that were intentionally made and used for their acoustical properties, and to what extent those would have bled into musicking or not, that's a little bit harder to determine. And so this is the reason why often, especially when we're looking far back into the past, or sometimes when we're looking at other cultures as well, sometimes we drop the term musical instrument and we use terms, sort of more neutral terms that have a wider scope, such as sound producers, for example. However, as maybe you're expecting by this point, this also opens up a whole can of worms, because the term sound producer, if you were to then apply it also to modern technologies, would also seem to maybe include something like this.
A banded, bulbous, flat.
This could be classified as a sound producer, or more specifically as a part of a sound producer, because what this is either an early version of the gramophone horn, or maybe a late iteration of a signet horn from a phonograph speaker. And the phonograph obviously is the first machine that was invented that could play back previously recorded sounds, and it was the precursor to the more well-known gramophone. Going by the history of speaker horn designs, it looks like this model would most likely be somewhere in the region of about 100 or so years old. But if there's any gramophone or phonograph enthusiasts out there, correct me if I'm wrong. I actually just happened to find this completely randomly in a secondhand store in America a few years ago. But basically anything like speakers, headphones, anything like that, right? Those would also seem to fall within the remit of sound producers, if we use that as a kind of umbrella term. And now again, obviously then there's other ways in which you could refine the definitions and find ways of either excluding those or including those. You could find objects that that very much blur the line between those ideas and also ideas of performance and reproduction. Things like samplers and other kinds of synthesizers that rely on pre-recorded sounds. So as with basically everything that we've been talking about so far, you could then go into this into so much more detail, and this conversation could literally go on forever. But I think that sort of breaking down a lot of these aspects and really sort of teasing out some of these elements in the way in which we've done today hopefully helps to show how very often in the ways in which we're defining these things, and even, for example, when we look back in the archaeological record, or we look at other cultures and we want to look for evidence, for example, of musical behaviors and those kinds of things, very often even just the ways in which we're asking the questions can come loaded with all kinds of very culturally contingent assumptions. And for example, I mean, in the way that we said, right, that there's objects that most people wouldn't consider to be musical instruments, but that very often are being used as musical instruments, such as the ruler. I think that even after everything we'd said, a lot of people would still kind of think, yes, but, you know, it's just, you know, stuff that happens, you know, when a kid's playing around in school or whatever, when someone's just idly kind of doing that, and discount that. It's not really being used to make music. And I think that part of that is because, again, we don't think of music as just being sort of a part and parcel of daily activities. And so we associate the idea of music with formalized performances and the what we described, which episode was it? Maybe episode 4, I can't remember, as sort of the ritual of the performance, the idea that there is this specific way in which music should be performed, and you have the musicians there on the stage and the audience is here, and then the musicians play for a bit, and then when they stop, everybody claps, and then people stop clapping and the musicians start playing again. And there's this very formalized idea that if you're doing music, then you should be doing it in these kinds of specific settings. And so even though this kind of game of twanging at a ruler on the side of the desk is a incredibly common form of musicking. I mean, it's happening all around the world all the time. Kids and even adults are just idly doing this every day. So in some ways, it's one of the most common forms of human musicking, but because it doesn't occur in these specific predefined ways in which we can sort of point at and say, well, that is music, you know, and that's, you know, it sort of ticks all the boxes of the kinds of things that we have learned and absorbed through our culture to kind of say, okay, those are the markers that tell me that is music. All these kinds of activities that are real things that are occurring in the world around us all the time, those are all the kinds of things that are very often ignored and that we don't really take account of in our conversations about music and musicking and these kinds of things, simply because our very sort of formalized academic approach to classifying and understanding and describing these kinds of things essentially excludes all of that from the conversation, even though, as we're saying, it's one of the most common forms of human musicking. It's a form of musicking that the vast majority of humans probably around the world have experienced either directly by performing it themselves or have seen someone else do it. And the fact that so many humans around the world are doing it should tell us that actually this is it tells us something very universal and very important about human musicking and should be worthy of being thought of and taken seriously, not necessarily with seriosity, because I hate the idea of taking things seriously in that way. But I think you understand what I'm saying. In essence, it's worthy of being acknowledged and discussed just as much as all those great examples of music that anyone like me who grew up playing and studying music would have been exposed to, and all of that musicology that you grew up studying. Something like this is just as important, and in fact, actually, I would say a lot more important, really, if we want to understand the core of human musicking and where it comes from and what it says about us as musical animals. And so all of this kind of very spontaneous human musicking, it's something that we do almost with the same spontaneity with which a flower blooms, just because that's what it does. And we make music because that's just what we do. And we almost can't stop ourselves, right? You give a kid a ruler and you have a musician. But these are things that the very ways in which we think about music almost completely exclude from our discourse about music. But anyway, so that's enough of me rambling on and on about musical instruments and rulers and showing you bits of bark. I mean, that really says something about me. I think that ostensibly this is a video about what is a musical instrument, and it's basically just a guy sat here with a ruler and some bits of tree bark. But to me, these are some of the most important core elements of musicking, and I hope you understand where I'm coming from with this. To me, it's these things are just mind blowing, like completely mind blowing. And anyway, though, so to kind of wrap things up, I wanted to give you a bit of an update of where I am with the music history, and also why it has taken me so long to get the new episode out, or like I was saying, episodes. And that's basically part of the reason, is that the new episode that I was working on ballooned in the end to such a big project that ultimately I've had to split it into 2 episodes. Even as it is, I think each one will end up probably lasting about an hour and a half or so. So essentially I've been working on 2 episodes at the same time, which is why it's taken me even longer than it normally does to get these ones out. But also hopefully it means that once I have it all in place and ready to go, then they'll be coming out in fairly rapid succession, hopefully within a few days of each other. And these episodes will be looking at the musicking and the place of music within Aboriginal Australian communities, specifically of the northern areas of Australia. And this is kind of something that I will probably specify multiple times in the episode itself, and that I think is important to point out, because I think that often, at least it seems to me, when Aboriginal Australian cultures are discussed in the West, they're kind of presented as very monolithic thing, as if it's just this one big continent and it's all kind of the traditional cultures there are all essentially the same. Whereas in fact what we find is an absolutely staggering diversity, dozens and dozens of different language groups with hundreds of different dialects. I think the estimate is somewhere in the region of about 600 or so. And so I think it's quite important to acknowledge that, because a lot of the kinds of things that we often associate with Australian Aboriginal musicking, didgeridoos, those kinds of things there, are actually specific to the northern traditions, and then we find other types of musicking in the southern areas, even though obviously there is also great amount of underlying interconnections due to exchanges and the forms of mutual exchange and the connections that lie along the song lines and the different points of connections between the different peoples. Now, in particular, the core of these episodes is going to revolve around the work of an anthropologist, David Turner, who over the course of about 3 or so decades of fairly continuous contact with the peoples of Groote Eylandt and Bickerton, he ultimately produced some of the work that, at least to me, is some of the most unique work that I have come across in anthropology and musicology. and one that very much does seem to endeavour to engage with the musicking and the place of the musicking within the society from the perspective of the very society itself, rather than coming at it from the outside, or at least doing that as much as it is possible for us who ultimately do approach these other cultures from the outside. And so also for my part, one of the reasons why it has taken me also longer to put this all together is that I think it's almost impossible to work on something like this without being conscious of the fact that you are dealing with the stories and the histories and the lived realities of actual human beings. And so it is important for me to do as much as I can from my perspective to endeavor to understand, again, as much as it is possible for me to do so, as much as I can understand, but making sure that I am doing as much as I can to understand and to seriously engage with and properly represent this perspective, and to properly honor the stories of actual human beings who have lived or who are living. And ultimately, if that means that it takes me a bit longer to get the episodes out, for me, I think that it's more than worth spending the time to make sure that I'm doing that as much as I can. And for those who have been following the music history for a while, and I mean, it's pretty amazing that you do, if you are. There's a few people who I know have been following this journey of mine for several years now, and it's pretty cool to see that, honestly. But for those who have been following the series, and honestly, it is very surprising to me to see that there are other people, not only who are interested in drilling into some of these topics in the way that I find fascinating, but also who are patient enough to wait for months for me to bring something new out, only for it to be another hour's worth of me just talking, basically. But for those who have been following and who are looking forward to more, you can rest assured that I will be continuing to work on the series. I mean, this is a choice that I made essentially a long time ago, a few years back when I first decided that I was embarking on this project, and I have no intention of stopping working on it. So yeah, I will definitely be continuing with the series. It's simply that the actual simple human reality of it, in terms of balancing all the different aspects of my life, and also endeavoring to make sure that I am putting in the work and the care that I feel that these topics deserve, and also endeavoring to present to you in as sincere and balanced a way possible the conclusions that I have reached through researching these topics. And so that simply means that, yes, there probably will be most instances where there will be a few months wait between each episode. And yes, I think at this point, this is basically evolving simply into some sort of lifelong project that ultimately I'll probably be, judging from how much ground we've covered so far, I'll probably be in my 70s and will be still talking about probably something like Byzantine music of the 9th century or something like that. We won't even be well into the Middle Ages, I suspect. But I think that it's worth doing for itself. And that's the only reason that I really do it. I do it simply to do it. I think that it is valuable and worth doing in and of itself. And for those of you who are happy to come along the journey with me and the the long waits that might entail, I'm super happy to have you on board.